As the German war machine surged east, a different kind of battle was unfolding behind Soviet lines. It wasn't fought with tanks or rifles, but with wrenches, train cars, and raw determination. Entire factories were being torn from the ground and sent east, beyond the Urals, in a desperate race against time. This week on the Eastern Front, while the Wehrmacht pushes towards Smolensk and Leningrad, the Soviets begin one of the most staggering industrial efforts in military history. But to benefit from this effort, the Soviet troops needed to continue their desperate defense. This series dives deep into complex and often sensitive historical topics that may not always align with YouTube's guidelines, so your support is essential. By becoming a member or patron, you're helping keep this project alive and ensuring we can continue delivering high-quality content to our viewers without worrying about demonetization. Our members and patrons have early access to the next 6 episodes. Become one by pressing the join button under the video or via the links in the description and pinned comment, and gain access to future Eastern Front videos and 200 other exclusive episodes. One of the most impressive industrial accomplishments in military history was just now beginning. This was the relocation of hundreds of Soviet factories from the west to the more protected territory east of the Ural mountain range. As early as June 24th, a committee had been established to facilitate the evacuation. It began in earnest in the first week of July and started to kick into high gear before the month was over. The evacuations would continue until December of 1941. This was an absolutely critical task if the Red Army was going to be able to continue the fighting. The field forces were losing unprecedented amounts of equipment. To make matters worse, the stockpiles were mostly obsolete. Modern equipment was being produced, but it was being consumed faster than it could be stocked for new units. In the last video, we saw KV-1s moving from factories directly to units to begin assaults. Emergency deployment of arms and ammunition to the frontline units would continue until much later in the war. To keep this going, the factories had to be moved. Lend-Lease equipment would not start arriving in serious numbers until 1942. It was decided that the factories would be dismantled, sometimes down to the wiring, and physically packed and moved east. This process was not easy. The Germans seemed to be unaware it was happening, and made no special effort to interrupt it if they were. The process of the dismantling, movement and reassembling of the industrial base was by no means an easy or straightforward one, even without German interference. The ongoing invasion made this a Herculean task. Many factories arrived at their destinations incomplete, late, in the wrong place, and sometimes all three. For the most part, the fighting of 1941 was done with weapons already produced. However, it is reasonable to question just how much the Red Army's rebuilding for the 1942 campaigns depended on the production achieved by the relocated factories of 1941. Of course, not everything needed by the war effort could be evacuated. Mines, roads, dams, and other components of hard infrastructure had to be left behind. In many cases, sabotage was employed to deny their use to the invaders. This sabotage was a deadly serious business that cost many lives and destroyed the work of countless men and women during the 5-year plans. Still, Stalin and his cronies decided it had to be done. As the battle for Smolensk began, the Luftwaffe was dealing with ever-decreasing numbers of planes to cover wider and wider areas of frontline units. The reduction of the pockets at Minsk and Bialystok was only accomplished with the immense dedication of Luftwaffe resources. This resulted in wear and tear on the planes, which delayed more comprehensive actions to support the encirclement efforts at Smolensk. Basing and supply routes became difficult for many of the units in the 2nd Air Corps, supporting the southern wing of Army Group Center. These difficulties meant that the BBS was able to find gaps in the protective air cover occasionally. Bombing runs by the ubiquitous IL-2 caused problems for the Heer. Ever-increasing numbers of Soviet fighters opposed the Luftwaffe. The Soviets were not ready to give up the air yet, even in the face of the enormous losses of June. Army Group North was busy with the drive on Leningrad. The Red Army had attempted an armoured counterattack at Ostrov against General Reinhardt's 41st Panzer Corps, but had failed to push them back. After this failure, desperation started to set in, as the Northwestern Front attempted to form a new blocking position at Luga, only 140 kilometers southwest of Leningrad. General Manstein's 56th Panzer Corps was mired in swampy woods and struggled to cover the essentially unguarded space between Ostrov and Luga. He arrived in Ostrov 5 days after Reinhardt. This delay was not unmanageable, but was starting to cause problems. Finally, on July 10th, he made it to Porkov, approximately 90 kilometers past Ostrov. The same day, Reinhardt made it to Luga, another 100 kilometers further. The gap was growing more dangerous, but Manstein worked to close it. He drove his forces to Soltsy as an attempt to outflank the Soviets at Luga. At the same time, the first assault at Luga by the 1st Panzer Division was stopped by dogged resistance. Reinhardt then sent the 6th Panzer on a wide flanking maneuver to the west. This was in keeping with the standard tactics of the panzer commanders. Encirclement instead of direct assault had been the basis of many great victories from Sedan to Minsk. There was just one problem. In the forests and marshes of the Baltic, the land dotted with lakes and small rivers, the panzers were incapable of the speed required for proper envelopment. Reinhardt was eventually able to fight his way into a small bridgehead at Luga, but this took the entire week to do so. The Soviets took advantage of the time and space given to them by the slow-moving Germans. The Northwestern Front moved significant forces, led by the 70th Rifle Division, into place on either side of Manstein's drawn-out lines, as he struggled to road march to Soltsy. A trap was set for the next week that was designed to crush the leading edge of the 56th Panzer Corps. On July 13th, the 8th Panzer Division arrived at Soltsy. Here, the trap would be sprung. Vatutin was ready to direct the battle in his new role as the Chief of Staff for the Northwestern Front. It was now the turn of the panzers to be the ones fighting desperately to break out of a pocket. Hoepner would need to step in to save Manstein from a real disaster, redirecting some forces away from the advance on Luga to help him. As Army Group North was unwittingly allowing its panzers to stumble through the Baltic forests into the jaws of a set trap, Army Group Center was starting the fighting for Smolensk. July 10th is often marked as the beginning of the battle. The counterattacks by Timoshenko's Western Front last week were necessary to buy him the time to assemble his main body of forces to resist the Germans at Smolensk. These counterattacks were failures in that they did not push the panzers back, but successes because they did allow him to move up vital fresh forces. None of it was enough, not the fresh divisions, the time, or the space. On the 9th of July, in the early morning, the 20th Panzer Division struck across the Dvina. The attack was straight out of the textbook and demolished the Soviet infantry of the 62nd Rifle Corps of the 22nd Army. Before nightfall, the panzers had arrived in Vitebsk. This was a remarkable strike that managed to cover 60 kilometers and fight through prepared Soviet positions. This was reminiscent of the first days of the war, and seemed to put to bed any suspicions of declining offensive power in the Wehrmacht's Panzer Arm. This was misleading, as the declining numbers of tanks and trucks testified. However, many of the Wehrmacht's leaders allowed themselves to be deceived by the continuing victories. Those beliefs would be tested before long. For now, the Wehrmacht was still in the dominant position. Timoshenko was reeling from this new assault that cut through his preparations so easily. The rest of the 39th Panzer Corps followed the 20th Panzer Division across the Dvina. Recognizing the threat, he clumsily threw the remainder of the 5th and 7th Mechanized Corps into the fight. They were brushed aside. In less than a week, Timoshenko had lost the best part of his armored reserve. Losing more than 800 tanks was a huge blow, and the assault on his lines was just beginning. In front of Guderian's panzer group across the Dnieper was the Soviet 13th Army. The 13th was still battered from the Minsk encirclement and had not received significant reinforcement. The tanks of the 47th Panzer Corps were barely even delayed by the remains of the 13th Army. Once across the river in force, they drove straight for the center of Smolensk. Timoshenko was being enveloped from both sides, same as his hapless predecessor had been in Minsk and Bialystok just 2 weeks prior. The 20th Army was still holding the line between Smolensk and Orsha, but this was rapidly becoming a moot point as the panzers drove further east to the north and south of these positions. Timoshenko fumbled about for reinforcements to throw at the spearheads. Two major factors prevented their effective employment. The first was that Timoshenko did not wait for a strong force to be assembled. Instead, incomplete tank divisions and rifle corps came off trains or road marches and attacked before they could organize. These attacks were never coordinated properly and couldn't possibly compete with the well-organized German units. The second factor was Timoshenko's poor intelligence of the positions and intentions of the panzers. This was not unique to the Battle of Smolensk and plagued the Red Army throughout Operation Barbarossa. Here, the poor tactical intelligence led Timoshenko to throw away any chance to isolate and destroy the panzers. This meant that he often marched his men deeper into developing pockets, instead of cutting off the spearheads of the panzer groups. On July 12, Zhukov sent an order from Stavka to Timoshenko. It directed that he begin a counter-offensive with all available land and air forces. Timoshenko complied with this order. He sent 6 armies over to the offensive. This was the largest counter-offensive of the war so far. One of the primary aims was to relieve the already encircled 13th Army at Mogilev. This was not achieved, although the distraction allowed some small elements of the battered 13th Army to make it back to Soviet lines. There were some small successes. The 63rd Rifle Corps, under the 4th Army, pushed elements of the 43rd Infantry Corps from the area around Rogachev. The area was a critical crossing point of the Dnipro River. However, victory was short-lived, as the infantry of the 63rd Rifle was left exposed by the failure of the other attacks on its flanks. There were other examples of squandered success up and down the front. Colonel General Gorodnikov had a 3-division-strong horse cavalry group that managed to break out behind German lines around this same time. They wreaked havoc with supply lines, but their effect was not as powerful as it could have been. Some of this was likely due to hesitancy about getting cut off themselves in the rapidly changing situation. Guderian paid little attention to these attacks and continued his drive to get around and behind Smolensk. The fighting would not be over in the same week it started. The scale was simply too large for a resolution to the battle to be accomplished in a week. By July 14th, the situation was dire, but the Western Front's fate was not yet sealed. Timoshenko could still save his men, if not Smolensk. For the southwestern and southern fronts, things were not going to be much better for the Red Army. Kleist's panzers had been divided and forced to pursue 2 divergent objectives. The 11th and 13th Panzer Divisions were struck in front of Kyiv by the counterattacks of the 4th, 9th, 19th and 22nd Mechanized Corps. The southwestern front was still strong, but it was strung out across western Ukraine. These tanks represented the last best chance Kupinos had to blunt the panzers' attack on Kyiv. At the same time as the southwestern front was throwing its last armoured reserves at the panzers in front of Kyiv, Lieutenant General Potapov was pulling the 5th Army back from positions at Korostyn. Kupinos ordered him to strike from the north, and Lieutenant General Muzichenko's 6th Army to attack from the south. Together with the mechanized corps in the center, these armies were to rescue the trapped 7th Rifle Corps. They hoped that in doing so, they could manage to cut off Kleist's spearhead in the direction of Kyiv. This was not out of their reach. All they managed was to delay the panzers at great cost. By July 13th, these 4 mechanized corps had only 95 tanks left. On the opening day of Barbarossa, these corps had been in possession of over 2,300 tanks. No matter the losses incurred by the Germans, it is hard to see anything other than a near-total victory for the Wehrmacht in the first 3 weeks of fighting in Ukraine. However, the fighting in front of Kyiv managed to delay the panzers long enough that Hitler was convinced that they could not manage to take Kyiv alone. Hitler reversed his earlier decree that Kleist would take Kyiv, while also conducting the southern encirclement at Uman. His new orders were that the encirclement was to be completed first, and then the entire army group would turn and take Kyiv. This was essentially a reversal and a tacit admission that he had been wrong just a few days after issuing his orders to Kleist. It was becoming apparent that Army Group South was not up to the task of seizing Kyiv and destroying the Red Army around Uman simultaneously. Even cutting off the Soviet forces in the area was proving difficult. Choosing to close the pocket at Uman instead of a place further to the east was a compromise of planning to fit with the actual combat power Army Group South could bring to bear. These deliberations continued for the rest of the week. The attack date was set for July 15th. In the meantime, Hitler continued to step into the role of Army Group Commander, shuffling individual divisions around the front. Underpinning every German plan at this stage of the war was the logistics question. The General Staff knew from the earliest stage of planning that the Russian rail lines would have to be converted to standard European gauge. There had been unfounded hopes that the quick strike across the border would be able to seize large amounts of Russian rolling stock. This would help to obviate the need for immediate rail conversion, but it never materialized. In the absence of the rolling stock needed for rail use, the gauge conversion process began. This was not a fast process in the best of conditions. The railroad troops tasked with the conversion were undermanned, poorly protected, and under-resourced. Furthermore, they were given conflicting missions due to the divergent needs of the commanders at the front and the long-term construction demands of the Quartermaster General. General Wagner was this latter figure. He needed the railroad troops to focus on building high-capacity lines behind each of the army groups. This involved more than simply regauging the track. Switching yards, turnabouts, signals, and more were needed to build proper high-capacity lines. Additionally, much of the track routes were not ideal. Even the tracks that could be simply regauged were often poorly engineered and installed. This lowered their carrying capacity significantly. This entire process was labor-intensive and required careful allocation of men and materiel to accomplish. General Wagner was assigned this because it was his job to make sure that the field forces received the supplies they needed. He was trying to facilitate the building of large supply dumps that could act as a buffer against the demands of the armies. The other side of the rail debate was that the field forces needed the tracks regauged as quickly as possible. This lowered the demand for their limited truck transport capabilities and allowed them to redeploy via rail, which was significantly easier for the men and equipment than marching. Unfortunately for the Wehrmacht in the east, there were not enough rail troops to go around. The end result was that neither mission was accomplished to the satisfaction of the opposing parties. The logistics of the Wehrmacht would continue to suffer as a result. From the opening days of the war, the strategic reserves of fuel were low, and the lack of certain other resources was affecting production. As the war dragged on, fuel became an immediate concern for field commanders. Some of this was due to production shortfalls. More relevant for the panzers was that fuel deliveries were dropping as they got further and further from Germany. The logistics apparatus could not keep up. This concludes our discussion for this week. Next week we will continue the week-by-week account of the entire war on the Eastern Front. We will watch the progress of Operation Barbarossa during the 3rd week of July. Stay tuned, and remember, this is just the beginning of the weekly Eastern Front of World War II series. We won't stop until we've covered the war week by week, from Smolensk to Stalingrad to Berlin. Don't forget to subscribe, comment, and share this video. It helps immensely. We've started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.